I would say, you know, don't be afraid to put yourself outside of your comfort zone, because typically when you do that, you open up optionality.
This is the Indianness Podcast, stories of success from leaders and changemakers of Indian origin. Why have Indians achieved success across so many different disciplines around the globe? I have no idea, but let's find out together, because every story is unique. I am very excited to have Sonalee Parekh with us today. She's the Chief Financial Officer for RingCentral, a large software company. She has been in leadership roles at Hewlett Packard, besides serving on several boards, and also has an over 20-year career on Wall Street. I invited her on this show as I was fascinated by her very unconventional career journey. Welcome, Sonalee. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Thank you, Sanjay. I am delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Sonalee, as we discussed before, this is really about your journey, and the purpose is for it to be there for posterity, but also to inspire, to motivate others who want to follow in your journey. But to really find out about your journey, we really have to go to the beginning. So, which means you really have to tell us, where were you born? Tell us about your parents, and maybe if there were grandparents, and then we'll get into other details around that.
Absolutely. Sounds like a very sensible place to start.
Mhm.
So if we go back to the very beginning, I was born in Montreal, Canada,
Mm.
and which is where I was born and raised. And I came a little bit early. I was a little bit premature by a couple of weeks. And when my mom called my Indian aunties to tell them that the baby had been born, they said, "No, April Fools, you're joking. There's no way." And well, I actually was here, and my parents were slightly unconventional in that my father was Indian and born and raised in India and moved to America when he was in his about 18 years old to attend university. And my mother was Canadian, first generation, because her father was born in England. And they would have been, one of the earlier interracial marriages. They were married in 1970. And so I am a product of a mixed relationship. And it's something that, I've felt my entire life, and in a very, very positive way. And, I remember asking my parents when I was quite young, how did my grandparents feel about meeting each of you? Because of course it wasn't really very traditional or conventional. And I thought that perhaps there might have been a little bit of, I don't know, trepidation on either side. And what my mom said to me was that my father's family welcomed her with open arms, partly because, and he is the eldest son, so the Motabai, but he was holding off on getting married. And I think they were quite keen just to see him married and hopefully start producing grandchildren. I'm actually the second child in my family. I have an older sister, Nisha, who's an engineer, and I'm sure we'll go into detail on the rest of my family. And my grandparents on both sides were absolutely thrilled with the marriage, and then ultimately with the grandchildren. And I was very close to my grandmother on my maternal side. I actually never got to meet my grandfather, my mother's father, because he passed away quite young, quite prematurely. And on my father's side, my Ba and Bapuji, I was also very close to, even though they lived in Mumbai, and they would visit every couple of years. I still felt a strong closeness to them and felt very, very loved by them. And I still, remember my grandfather singing to me. And although my grandmother did not speak English almost at all. She had a couple of words. I still felt like we were able to communicate. And that's one of those things about family. And, I still feel their presence very much in my life today. Even though we were separated by large distances, that sort of overwhelming feeling of love and family was very much a part of my young upbringing, and hopefully it's something that I've been able to pass on to my children, and I certainly see it with my nieces and nephews. We're a very, very close and tightly knit family.
Oh, that's very, very fascinating, Sonalee. So, born in Montreal, dad came from Mumbai, which is now Mumbai, from Bombay.
Bombay.
Yeah, grandparents were there. Mom was here originally. Family came from England. Um, did you travel to Mumbai frequently when you were growing up, or did just the grandparents come in? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So remember, in those days, born in 73, traveling was very, very expensive. It's not the way it is today. So yes, we did travel to India, and my father felt it was very important for us to see India and also meet some of the relatives, because I still had cousins and aunts and uncles who were in Bombay. Felt it was very important for us to know them and meet them. But we only went every couple of years. So my first trip to India, I remember it extremely vividly. I was 5 years old. And again, those memories are very, very strong, because, seeing India for the first time as someone who's grown up in Canada and Montreal, I mean, talk about culture shock, and just, India is full of, sort of black and white, and the juxtaposition. And I remember it so vividly. But then, and we traveled quite extensively around India for several months when I was 5 years old. My parents took us out of school to do that. And I remember the school was very, very supportive, because they said there's no better education than going back and seeing where you're from, and traveling around India and spending time with relatives. And then we went back again when I was 14 years old, as a family. I then traveled to India a couple of times on business when I was living in London. And then when my father passed away, we went back to India as a family, as to do a memorial for him. But it was also really important for us it was the first time that my children and my sisters and brothers' children saw India. So that was a really, really important trip that we did in 2018. So we returned to India, but not that frequently. And fortunately, my grandparents were well enough and had the means to be able to come to see us every couple of years.
So you didn't go as often. I mean, you have vivid memories when you were 5, but grandparents would come in and visit you. And you said grandmother didn't speak much English. Did you get to learn Gujarati as you were growing up?
Well, I can count to 10. I can ask for water. I can say hello and goodbye. No, I didn't. And it wasn't for lack of trying.
Because language is a very important aspect of the bond that people have in many, many ways. And memories also, by the way. That's the reason I'm asking.
Yes. And my grandfather was so fluent in English. My Babaji. I mean, he spoke perfect English. And my father did want us to speak Gujarati. But you have to keep in mind, when you're in a household where only one parent speaks the language, you don't get to hear it. And we did go, I remember we did Saturday school to try and learn Gujarati. But in the end, it was, we had lots of other things that we were doing too, sport and, wanting to hang out with friends. And so it wasn't something that we were able to continue with. And of course, like looking back, and anyone who's listening to this now, I do regret it. I wish I spoke Gujarati and Hindi. And so you're right, language is super important in terms of communication, but my grandfather was always there when my grandmother was visiting, not to mention my dad. So he would translate, and, my grandmother would just be there with us in the room when we would be, telling stories. And, I even remember she used to come and do bedtimes with us, even though she didn't speak English. And again, I felt very, very loved by her. And I respected her so much because she was married at a very young age. I think it was 15. My grandfather was a lot older than her. They had a great marriage, but she had many, many children, and she also lost children at older stages. Like losing a baby, losing any child is very, very hard. But I remember she lost children when they were 16 and 18, and just what she went through. I had so much respect for her. She was an amazing woman. And I actually wish, of course, that I could have spoken to her more and known the language, but it didn't change the fact that she had a significant influence on me, and that she was very much a part of, my tie to India and my tie to my Indian relatives, and just someone who I still think about a lot today.
What do you think inspired you about her? Is it that her resilience, her character? What is it that she's still positive despite such serious losses? As there's no bigger loss than losing a child ever.
There's no bigger loss. And yeah, so I think it's all of those things. It's she was unbelievably resilient and unbelievably strong, and she kept the family together. And my grandfather was a very hard worker, very he had several careers, but he had lots of passion projects as well. And he was a pilot. And actually, little known fact, or a piece of trivia, he was the first Indian to ever build and fly a plane. He did this with a subscription to Popular Mechanics magazine, and finding parts. Talk about necessity is the mother of invention. He just, it's incredible what he achieved. And then he flew for the Maharaja. He was part of the RAF. But my grandmother, was there running the household with at times, 12, 13 children. And I remember asking, like, how did you do that with so many kids? And the answer was, of course, there was this enormous family of many, many children, but she delegated. There was a daughter who would look after these 3 much younger children, and then another daughter who would look after, and then a son who would, and it's amazing. She found a way to really make it work. And all of the children in that family, are highly educated. They went on to achieve so much, and that was, I think, in many ways down to her influence, and how much she was selfless as well. She invested so much of herself into her children and into her family. And again, against, when I look at how I've been brought up, and I've been allowed to be, in fact, a little bit selfish, and she didn't have that luxury. So I respect that so much. And any time that I sort of have a setback or feel like life isn't going my way, I think about what she had to deal with. And I don't spend too much time feeling sorry for myself. And I get right back on the, whatever it is I'm working on, because, she's someone who is a role model to me. Now, she didn't have a career in the sense, or in the way that I do, but she had a very strong sense of self and sense of what was important, and, values that were, very, very clearly set.
So Ba was a big influence for you. Would you say that? So
Always,
yeah.
absolutely. And Bapuji, both. and I love them dearly. And
Wow.
I think, sometimes when I have great milestones in my life, I think, oh, I would love to be able to share them with Ban Bapuji.
Wow. Um, Tell us about Dan a little bit. What did he do? I mean, came as a student when he was 18 or so, got married early. What was his occupation in Montreal?
He came as a student when he was 18. He did not get married early.
Oh, he
I
didn't.
think he might have been a bit of a man about town,
Uh-oh.
I'm sure there were a few women before my mom, but she would know that. I think he was a bit of a ladies' man. He was very, very handsome and very charismatic. And although he was an engineer and probably among the top 5 smartest people I've ever met in my life, I mean, he had a beautiful, huge brain and ability to um, process and understand things, and he was unbelievable. But he was also, you know, very, very sentimental and very, very loving and caring. And it was so clear that family came first above all else. And, having that kind of father means that you can go out and take risks because you always have this, huge safety net to be able to go out and pursue things. And he always gave me great advice as well. He was a friend and a mentor and a therapist at times. I know my sister would say he was a great therapist. But he was unbelievably intelligent and hardworking. I think a lot of my work ethic came from him. And he came over when he was 18. And I mean, he worked all kinds of jobs because he came over with, virtually nothing in his pockets. And immediately, got a first job at the YMCA. He also did, quite a few jobs sort of as manual labor. And then finally he got a bit of a dream job in the form of a draftsman, where he was actually using some of his training, and this was all whilst he was going to school. He went to the University of West Virginia on a scholarship and studied engineering. And he was an engineer, a mining engineer. That's what his degree was in. And then he later worked for various engineering firms. And then when he was about just under 40 years old, he started his own engineering firm and was very successful. And actually, my brother still works in that company today. My father's unfortunately no longer with us, but my brother still, is very much taking that business forward. And, my dad was someone who I was told he originally wanted sons, and he ended up with 3 daughters in a row, and then son much, much later on. But if he did want sons, I didn't know it or feel it. I grew up for the first 10 years of my life just with my 2 sisters. I have a sister who's 18 months older than me and a sister who's 2 years younger than me. And then again, my brother came 10 years later. But my dad was someone who just really encouraged us to go out and be our best selves and to not limit ourselves. And I remember, little girls play house and play teacher and play school. And I remember my dad used to say, oh, what are you playing, or what are you working on? And we'd say, oh, I'm the teacher and my sister's the student, or I'm the nurse and this is the patient. And my dad would say, teachers are great, but, you can be a professor and a professor of anything. And nurses are wonderful, but why don't you be the doctor? And, be the astronaut, be the pilot, and I feel like in our household, there was almost no kind of awareness of like my gender holding me or us back in any way. And I know that still holds young girls back today. And this is, I'm 50. So going back 50 years, I feel like my father was such a forward thinker. And I know many, there's sort of Indian households are very well known for being very focused on, having a profession and valuing education highly, which he absolutely did. But, there are also traditional aspects to Indian households, which I feel he didn't uh, really hold to, or he didn't expect us to be limited by. And I love that. And when you're young, you don't necessarily know when your parents are sort of stepping out of what is traditional, because you only know what you know. And when I look back now, I just think, wow, my parents, both of them, they were trailblazers. And I think it's just allowed me to be this person who kind of grabs life and grabs opportunities and doesn't hold back, and self-belief as well. And I think that's really important. And I think my father was so important in instilling that in myself and my sisters and my brother. And I'm so grateful to him for that. And I think about my father every single day. He passed away in 2016. I so wish I could tell him about my career now. Um, he would be so proud, I know. And of course he's looking down, but he was a huge influence on me, and again, a mentor, and just a wonderful, wonderful person to, have on your side and be backing you and be your cheerleader.
So very forward thinking. He had your back, and encouraging you constantly. And looking down, he probably is very, very proud of what you have accomplished. Sonalee, how about mom?
Yeah. So my mom is grew up in Canada, but
Mhm,
grew up in a very small little town
mhm,
called Elora, Ontario. And so very different again from the way I grew up in Montreal, very cosmopolitan, large city. Of course, there's the whole French influence. So she grew up in a very different environment. And her parents, and I was very close to my grandmother, maternal grandmother, my Nana.
mhm,
Um, Her father had a stroke when he was really young, in his 30s, and it
mhm,
was extremely debilitating. And he lost, the use of an entire side of his body. He pretty much lost the ability to speak clearly. He had to speak in a very slurred um, voice. And although my parents, my grandparents were very, very loving and very, very supportive, money was tight around their
mhm.
household, and they had to, be very economical about, the way they did things. And again, I was very fortunate in comparison. But one thing I would say is that um, my mom also had an aunt and uncle who I knew well, Aunt Bessie and Uncle Chris. And they were very, very involved also in raising my mom, and they weren't able to have children. And fortunately, they were able to provide my mom with lots of enrichment and opportunities that her parents might not have been able to provide her. And so, lots of trips and exposure to books, and ultimately helping for her to pay to go to university. And my mom is also extremely intelligent in a different way from my dad. But just to give you an idea, and they would never do this today, but she skipped 3 grades. She skipped 3 grades. I mean, she looks back and she thinks, oh my gosh, how could they have done that to me? Because I was a little girl and here I was. But she is, I don't know if you know Matilda, Roald Dahl Matilda, the little girl who just reads and reads and reads. My mother is like a living Matilda. And when she was a little girl, I think by the time she was 10, she had read every single book in her local library. The library was only open 3 days a week. She always says to me, oh, she wishes it was open 5 or 7 days a week. And she would queue up. She'd be right at the door as soon as the librarian got there with whatever new books had come from Toronto, and she wanted to read them. And she is still an avid reader. I think, reading 30 books a month would not be unusual. So she is unbelievably well read, and that gives her all sorts of perspectives on, a wide range of subjects. And also I would say both of my parents, I would say, were very like open-minded liberal thinkers. And that certainly was passed down to the children. I think part of that is having been so well read. And the other thing I will say about my mom, and she's incredibly supportive and loving and an amazing mom. She also is, a really great friend and, sister and sister-in-law to my father's sisters and brothers. And she's the one that everybody calls. She's sort of the agony aunt. And she gives the best advice on earth. Anytime even I have a friend who has a problem, I always say, let's get my mom on the phone. She'll figure this out. Let's figure that. And so she's a wonderful human being. I wish I could be more like her. And she had a career as a social worker. And in Quebec, when you're a social worker, you work for the government. And I think she was very successful in that. She did take about 10 years off when my sisters and I were very little, because she had us in such close succession. We're sort of a year and a half, 2 years apart. But she's a superwoman. And she managed to do it all. And she did it all without help and without a cleaning lady and without, all the things that I kind of take for granted today. She didn't have, and she did a miraculous, fabulous job.
Super mom,
Yes.
and super dad. So you were really lucky and with amazing grandparents. So was it growing up, going to school in Montreal? How was it? Did you have any challenges? Tell us what were some key inflection points on that journey as you
Yeah.
were, and was it all in Montreal, or did you go to high school somewhere else? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it was all in Montreal. I went to the local preschool and then the local elementary school, not private schools. So these were public schools. And then I went to a high school that was just outside of the town where we lived. I grew up in a city called Dorval. It's actually where the Montreal Trudeau International Airport is, in Dorval. And so what I would say there is that my sisters and I, and certainly my older sister and I, we were very good students. We didn't bring home anything less than an A, apart from, I think, in art. That's the only subject that I didn't get an A in. Yeah. And I remember I used to actually ask a friend of mine to do some of my art projects. I was that bad. But my mom would say that I come by it honestly, because she's not great at art either. But we were really strong students. And as a result of that, there's a bit of a halo that goes with that. And we were given lots and lots of opportunities in school to be enriched and be kind of streamed in certain subjects. And I loved my elementary school experience. It was co-ed. I had tons of friends. I'm a pretty social person. I still am. I get a lot of energy from being around other people. And I was also really active in sport. So I was a big soccer player, figure skater. In the summer, I did synchronized swimming, diving, swim team, and water polo. And then I ran track and field as well, and also did cross-country running. So I got very involved. And then later, when I was in high school, I trained to be a lifeguard, and I did that job from the age of 15 to I guess 21. Yeah, until I had my first real job. But I loved it. And that came with with its own social life too, all the lifeguards. And so I would say it was a pretty bucolic time and period in my life. And, when you ask about challenges, um, the challenges were how can I get to the next level, or how can I, you know, um, be even better at school? How can I work even harder? How can I, line myself up to have a great job, things like that. So it was, I didn't feel like there were a lot of challenges in terms of, certainly I never felt any amount of racism at all. And I was, to be clear, the only Indian kid in my class. And I never felt any kind of, I never felt treated differently in any way, um, which is great. And I think that's partly because, it's Montreal, like super cosmopolitan. Um, and the other thing is, I didn't grow up around a lot of other Indian children. Like a lot of my Indian cousins, even the ones who lived in Toronto, they were around a lot of other Indians. Most of my exposure to other Indian kids or other Indians, period, was family. My cousins and my aunties and my uncles, and grandparents. So in that sense, I never felt kind of any struggle there. And I know others have, so I don't want to diminish that. But I never felt it. And if anything, I feel like in some ways it's given me a bit of an X factor. Certainly, like as I got, and I think my sisters would say this too, like certainly as I got to high school, it's nice to be a little bit different and, exotic, and people don't quite know where you're from, and, like, oh, maybe there's an interesting story here. And if anything, I think it was a nice advantage.
Yeah. So what about high school? How was
Yes.
high school?
Yeah. So high school, I again went to a public high school, was very, very involved in a number of activities. And by then, I think I knew, um, particularly with my grades and my interests, that I was probably going to want to, get into a profession. And I was starting to get, I really liked numbers a lot. And, I started talking to my dad about being a chartered accountant. And I remember he introduced me to his accountant, and, we started having those early conversations about, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Like, what do you really want to be? And again, without, he never wanted to limit me in any way, but I think he definitely pushed in certain other directions. He was an engineer. We have lots of engineers in the family. My older sister was already showing signs that she wanted to go into engineering. But I eschewed that and stayed very much on the chartered accountancy train or path. And high school was wonderful in terms of, I had a super active social life. I had a boyfriend, a very serious boyfriend. I remember my Indian aunties used to say, studies first, boyfriend second. I didn't do it in that order. But I had this actually a really amazing, kind, supportive, loving boyfriend who I dated for 5 years from the age of 15 to 20. And I still know him today. He still lives in Montreal, but my parents were really cool with it. The only rule my dad had was like, no boys upstairs, but we could live with that. But he even used to come on family holidays with us. Like he was very much a part of the family. And I was really close to my siblings, and my siblings were close to him. And by then, my brother's 10 years younger than me, and I have almost like a maternal relationship with my brother because it's almost generational. Like to the never had an argument. Um I love him in the same way I love my sons or my nieces. And by then my brother was, if I was in high school, he was sort of starting to be a real person, talking and hanging out. And I remember my brother used to coach my boyfriend used to coach his soccer team. And, we were just all very, very close. And it was a really, really happy time, high school. The only thing that I would say in terms of challenges, and this is like me opening up, is my dad definitely drank too much. And when I was in elementary school, I don't think I noticed it in quite the same way. But then when you get to high school, you're much more aware of those things. And I remember a couple of times thinking like, oh, I don't know if I want to have friends over if dad will have had too many beers by then. And that was the only thing I would say was a bit of a challenge for me. And I think my sisters. And it's not like he was like violent or in any way, but it was just more the unpredictability. And as a high school student, you tread a little bit carefully around that. And we had a great house and we had a beautiful home, and like my house was the place where lots of my friends would come and hang out and sleep over, and because my parents kind of were really cool about that. Not boys, but girlfriends. And again, I for the first time ever, I was sort of aware of this. And I know that my grandfather, like Bapuji, also liked to drink. And I didn't see that as much because I didn't have as much exposure to him, but I know he did.
And was that an issue with mom?
No, it wasn't an issue, but she was certainly aware of it. Because it would have been impossible not to be aware of it. And, she managed the situation. And even I did. Like, if I knew I needed to ask my dad for something, there was a right time and place to do it. And it probably wasn't going to be after 7 p.m. And again, he was very like, he would still want you to come and sit with him and hang out with him. But it was, alcohol changes people. It does.
Yeah. What about college? How did you decide where to go, what to do? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So college, I went to McGill University. So I stayed in Montreal. I clearly, loved Montreal. And it's a pretty amazing place to go to college because it's a campus right in the heart of downtown Montreal. And Montreal has a fabulous nightlife, great party scene, a great cultural scene. I think we were the original foodie city. I'm just going to say it. Shout out to Montreal. And again, I think it's because it's this multicultural place. So many different cuisines that converge. And so McGill was an easy choice for me. And I got in. We don't really have the concept of early decision in Canada the way you do in the United States. But I got in on this. It was almost like extraordinarily early decision. They wrote to me and said, "We want you. Take this letter to the administration building. We'll even let you choose your courses ahead of everyone else. Like, we just want your acceptance." Yeah. And I remember receiving that letter and being so excited to share it with my parents and my older sister. And, I don't want to make her feel bad, but she didn't get into McGill. And yeah, I know. Sorry, Nisha. She went to École Polytechnique, which is the engineering school, Université de Montréal, which is a great school. But I think because of that, it felt that much more exciting. And I guess my parents felt this too, but like part of us thought, oh, well, if Nisha didn't get in and she's such an amazing student, like let's hope Sonalee gets in. And I got in on this like very, very early acceptance. And I didn't even know that those letters existed. And here I received it. And And so I went to school in the Faculty of Management. It's a Bachelor of Commerce degree that you get out of it, that you graduate with. And again, I loved finance. I loved accounting. I loved strategy. All the courses, all the things that I loved, I was able to really go deep on at McGill. And the 3 years flew by. I had such a blast there. I hope my younger son goes to McGill. My older son's going to go to Boston College, but in the fall. But I had a great experience there. My younger sister ended up going to McGill as well, and we were there together, which was amazing. Yeah, and we had a lot of friends in common. I also had a very serious boyfriend at McGill um, for, yeah, probably 5 or so years. And actually he was Jewish, and not terribly religious Jewish. Like he wasn't but he was Jewish, and I actually at that point, our relationship was so serious. And we were talking about maybe getting married, and I considered converting, and it's something I absolutely would have done. I would have done that. Because I'm not a terribly religious person. And religion hasn't been a big part of our lives. And both of my parents, I would say, were agnostic atheist. And I think that kind of ends up transcending. Like we're big believers in traditions and values, and but we kind of take the various things that we love from the world's religions and put them together into our own. And but anyway, so I dated a great guy, still in touch with him. He's also a chief financial officer of a public company. And we pushed each other. Like, we were competitive with each other at school. And I was very close to his family. I loved them. I still love them today, but they were so kind and warm and treated me like their daughter. And it was a really special time. And it was when I look back on life, I would say those couple of years at McGill were, stand out as potentially the best years of my life. Yeah, yeah.
So, McGill came to an end. How did you, what was the decision in terms of jobs or future? Were there any decisions there, Sonalee?
Yeah, so McGill came to an end, and I decided I wanted to go down the chartered accountancy designation, which in Quebec means you have to do 2 more years of studies to get the designation. But you do it at the same time as articling with a accounting firm. And while I was at McGill, I I was one of the executives on the accounting club. That's how exciting I was. And I managed to get a great summer internship at Pricewaterhouse. And again, these were really competitive internships because Montreal, it's a big city, but it's not like Toronto or New York or San Francisco. So there were 5 intern jobs available at Pricewaterhouse, and I knew Pricewaterhouse was the one I wanted. And it was the one that my dad and I were really leaning into. And I got to know the head of recruitment there really well as part of my accounting club. I remember her name was Lynn Sachs. She was fabulous. And I got one of these really exclusive internships. And then the great thing about that was at the end of the summer, they make you an offer for full time. So when you go back to your last year of college, of university, you're going to be going into a full-time job. So you can be a bit more relaxed and laid back. And so I studied and worked for 2 years after I did my undergrad, and then got my chartered accountancy designation. And at that time, in Canada, you write what's called the uniform final exam to become a chartered accountant. It's a really tough exam. It's 50% pass rate. And I ranked in the country. Yes. And that was a big moment because what it meant was a lot of employers started reaching out to me, again, getting letters, and your pictures in the newspaper, and it's there's a lot of pomp and circumstance that goes with it. And at that time I decided I probably didn't want to stay in accounting. And I moved at that point, packed up my bags and I moved to London, England, to the UK, where of course my grandfather was born. So I was able to get a visa. And I moved when I was 24 years old. So I left Montreal for the first time, and packed my bags and moved to London. And I didn't really know anybody in London. And that's when I started my career in it's called the City, but basically Wall Street. And I took a job at Lehman Brothers and changed careers and became an equity analyst covering telecommunication stocks. And it was a really exciting time in the market because there was a lot going on in Europe, and all of the telecom companies, which were these huge cash flow machines, they were privatizing. So they had been owned by the governments and they were privatizing for the first time. So there was just a ton of really interesting work to do. And at the time that I moved to London, I remember my dad especially, really didn't want me to go. And I think now that I'm a parent, I see, these sort of milestones in your children's lives. And I think he probably knew then, okay, if she's leaving Montreal, she might never come back. And I remember saying, like, I'm just going for 2 years. I'm just going to go and travel and have fun and see the world. But I'm coming back. Montreal is my home. And he was right to worry a little because I never did come back. And at the time, the plan was, I would do an MBA. Again, this was planned with my parents, you'll go do an Ivy League MBA. You've got the grades, you've got the work experience, you've got go do your 2 years in London and then start applying to Harvard and Wharton and, Stanford. And those 2 years went by. And I remember calling my parents and saying, I have Harvard and Wharton MBAs working for me because I spent the last 3 years, in London. Well, a year in Montreal and then 2 years in London on Wall Street and working on really big deals. And then, people who are graduating from MBA, they haven't had that experience. So I said, now's not the right time for me to stop on this, great career trajectory I'm on. And I did love my work. And so I stayed in London, and that's actually where my children were born and raised for the first 12 and 14 years of their lives.
Wow. Wow. What an incredible journey. Sonalee, when you look back, I think I know, but can you pick one or two or three, just briefly, inflection points that were, kind of determining? I mean, you are right now CFO for a successful software company. You had a 20-year career in Wall Street, and you sit on boards. You were in a key role at HP. But what were some of the inflection points? Moving to London, was that an inflection point?
Huge inflection point. Absolutely. And it was one of these kind of sliding doors moments where, again, I was in a very serious relationship with somebody. But I think he had a view in terms of what our lives were going, the path that we were on. And I realized I wanted something different. And, actually one of my Achilles, I think a little bit, is that I'm a people pleaser, which my mom always says to me, when you're a people pleaser, you please everybody but yourself. Yes. So at that point I realized, that's actually not what I want. And it was a really hard thing to do. But I moved to London and again, like, started this very different career, and the opportunity set in London was so much wider than what was available to me in Montreal at the time. Partly because, Montreal was going through a difficult political backdrop with the French, English, Quebec separation. And, It felt at the time very much like English was not the language of advancement. Now I am bilingual. I went to school, to elementary school in French, but still, it just didn't feel like it was going to be a place where I would flourish. And I was really career driven. I knew I wanted to accomplish things career wise, and London felt like, I remember going to interview at in London, and I had so many job offers. And same couldn't be said in Montreal. I felt like I was much more limited. So, I spread the proverbial wings and moved to London. That was definitely a tipping point or inflection point. And, when I look back, of course it was the right thing to do, because I ended up with this career that I love so much and opportunities that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. But I had to, it wasn't easy, like landing in London, not knowing a soul. I remember, looking for, and the exchange rate, the Canadian dollar to the British pound was 2.7 to 1 at the time. So I felt pretty poor. And I remember when we were trying to find our first flat. So my boyfriend, who later became my husband, was with me, and we couldn't believe the down payment you had to put to get the flat. And we were thinking, like, how are we ever going to raise enough money to even have a flat? And we were doing it from payphones, and you had to pay to make local calls. And I remember like putting in more and more coins, and it was pouring outside, and nothing was online back then. So we had this thing called the Loot, where we were looking for apartments. But I mean, it's those experiences that kind of make you who you are, right? And it's sort of the hardship. When you talk about challenges, and you asked about challenges, like I remember that feeling very challenging. And I remember some of the people that I met when I first got to London were saying to me, London can be a lonely place. Like, be sure that you're ready for this. And it was great. And London is such a special city. And like London still in so many ways feels like my home. I spent 20 plus years there, and my kids were born and raised there. So I think that also makes it feel very much like home. But that was certainly an inflection point, that move. And again, it wasn't super smooth. It was hard. It was one of the hardest things I've done, but yet I see it as a positive inflection point. I think another inflection point for me was when I worked at Goldman Sachs for about 8 years. And it's actually where I was when I had my 2 children. And I remember coming back from my second maternity leave, and it was post the global financial crisis. Again, a difficult, challenging time. And I remember coming back, and a lot of the management had changed, and a lot of the mentors who had hired me into the business were gone. And I realized, it wasn't, I didn't feel comfortable there in the way I did for, the previous 7 years. And I decided to move jobs, and I went to Barclays Capital and went to go join one of my great mentors. His name is Howard Spooner, but he had a huge influence on my career and invested a lot in me. And, again, it was about going after where I felt the opportunity was. And it would have been easy to stay at Goldman Sachs. I was actually being promoted. I was running a very, very large team, but I felt like I might have been limiting myself there, given some of the other changes. And I moved and changed jobs. And again, every time you change jobs, it's, you're reinventing yourself to a certain extent. But it's worthwhile because, all the upside that then comes with it. And then I would say, the final inflection point was when I decided to leave the UK, and we decided as a family to leave the UK to go and pursue an operating role at Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and to go and join a former mentor of mine who was the chief financial officer of Hewlett Packard Enterprise. And again, that was a huge move, going from London, England to Silicon Valley, going from working, spending 20 years in investment banking to becoming an operator. But it was such a great move. So I would say, like, when I look back and as I reflect, they were really hard, those things, but they were absolutely the right thing to do. And so I think, there's a lesson in that for everyone.
And what is the lesson for our listeners?
Yeah.
Because change, as you said, is hard, and you don't know what's at the end of that change. So what would you tell the people who are listening to Sonalee and CFO of RingCentral?
Yeah, I
And
would say, oh, sorry.
no,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I would say, don't be afraid to put yourself outside of your comfort zone, because typically when you do that, you open up optionality. It's the opposite of restricting yourself, and you widen your aperture. So it's obviously easier to stay in what you're doing. And rinse, wash, repeat can get really comfortable, but I'm going to say push yourself to be uncomfortable. And I still challenge myself to do that now and today, and in my job as well.
So push yourself to be uncomfortable. I think that's a great message. Sonalee, you mentioned a couple of mentors along the way. Every guest comes here and talks about the role of mentors. Can you briefly tell our guests, how do you go about identifying mentors, and how valuable are they? Whether it's, and mentors come in many shapes and sizes. You talked about the role of your dad, you talked about the role of your mother, you talked about Ba, but just very briefly, for our listeners listening to you, what are mentors? What do mentors mean to you?
Yeah, so I am a collector of mentors. I love having mentors in various aspects of my life, not just professional, even personal. And as you say, they come in all various shapes and sizes. I typically like to choose a mentor that's not necessarily exactly in my industry or in my wheelhouse or swim lane, because I think an external perspective can be so valuable. And I'm always afraid of that kind of echo chamber, or the emperor has no clothes. And I've seen that in many instances. So I think really important to, again, have that outside in perspective. And don't go and look for a mentor that's a carbon copy of you, And again, I think that's sometimes the temptation. And so, I would say push yourself to not go where it's easy. And I'm actually very calculated and prescriptive about choosing mentors. And I hope that doesn't sound disingenuous, but like, I literally will have a target list of, I would really like to get this person's perspective, and who do I know that might be able to introduce me to that person? And so I'm actually like fairly prescriptive about it. And then of course there's people in your career who you come across who you really admire and you observe and you think, I would like to learn and be able to be a lot more like that person. And there's certain character traits, and it usually tends to be areas where I see somebody excel and I don't have that superpower, but I'd really like to cultivate it. And that's another thing I do. And I do a lot of observation of executives and observation of people and various and observation and reflection. And then I think, yeah, that's where I need bulking up, or that's where I need to push myself. And I've been really lucky with mentors. I had a fabulous mentor at Lehman Brothers. Her name is Karen Egan. She is still one of my best friends in the universe. We're actually godmother to each other's children, but she hired me into Lehman Brothers. And she was amazing in terms of empowering me to do things. And really, it wasn't even just delegation. It was, she allowed me to take risks and take on big pieces of work, and sort of showed me that, I could do it. And I've taken a lot away from that. And that's how I manage my people, and my teams. And I know when I get 360 feedback, teams and people I work with really appreciate that. So she gave me these opportunities to stretch myself. So she was a really important mentor. And then I had, Howard Spooner, when I was at Goldman Sachs. Again, incredibly resilient person, but also he came from a very different part of the business from me, but he helped me make better decisions, and he helped me a lot with my professional judgment and trusting my judgment. And he taught me how to get conviction around something, and a lot of my ability to influence, because that is such an important skill as an executive, that ability to influence. That's important as an operator. That's important as a board member. That's important as, a team member, a peer. And he was extremely, helpful in cultivating those skills in me. And then, since I've moved to the Valley, I have a handful of fabulous mentors. And I remember when I first got to the Valley, someone said to me, you'll always be treated like an outsider here. And I remember being a little bit, taken aback. And I will tell you, I do not feel like an outsider here. I feel totally ingrained in this community, a community that I love, by the way. I absolutely love and feel like it is such a privilege to be part of this ecosystem here. And I think it was great mentors that have allowed me to feel the way I do, so at home here. So it's mentors have played a huge and important role in my life. And I also feel it's an honor and a privilege when somebody asks me to mentor them. And I am both formal and informal mentor to several people. It tends to be more women, but men or women, I find it a privilege and a part of my role and kind of where I'm at in life, where I can really give back in many ways.
So I think the message for our folks, if I may summarize, is find somebody who's not a carbon copy of you. You are actually pretty strategic in terms of looking for mentors, identifying skills that maybe you admire or you want to grow into. So I think those are excellent points, and these mentors play an incredible role. Sonalee, at the end, and I could, like I said, go on, but we generally like to ask some quick lightning round questions, very brief ones. If you were to, give us, we ask this to all our guests, your definition of Indianness, what would that be?
Oh, so for me, Indianness is really about the values. And I'm going to go back to where we started, strong sense of family, desire to give back, providing guidance, support, and love, and, being proud of who you are. And in my case, being proud of being different from a lot of the people that I grew up with.
Values, being proud of who you are, and being proud of being different. So I'm going to ask you a little tough question. One person who really you think has been the most influential person in your journey. One. I mean, I have some guesses, but let's see if you surprise us. One.
My dad. My dad.
I thought so.
I love you, Mom. I love so many people, but my dad, no question.
And I hope he is listening and he's watching and be very, very proud. Um, Sonali, Nike's tagline is "Just Do It." What is Sonali's tagline?
Oh, this is a tougher one. My
Yeah,
tagline, don't hold back.
don't hold back. Well, that's a pretty good one. I'm going to just ask you one question, and I don't know if you are not doing this line, I'm just curious because of the feeling that I got. If you are not the finance, accounting, the chartered accountant, have you thought if there was a parallel path in your life, what would have been an interesting career choice for you?
Yeah, so I do think that I might have won. So parallel life, and you know what?
Mhm.
It's never too late, right?
It never is too late.
Um, I think doing something more entrepreneurial,
Something more
having
entrepreneurial.
having my own business and
Well, that's something I think that's in your future. So, but is there anything that you say could have, should have, would have?
oh, honestly, I find regret is not very helpful.
Okay, good.
And yeah, and what I will say is I feel extremely, extremely happy and satisfied with my life. And I feel like there were so many people who we talked about today who played a huge role in,
Mhm.
helping me become the person I am today. So no, I'm not going to talk about regrets. Okay, actually one regret, maybe. It's never the right time to have a baby, right? And I had two sons. And I think maybe when I look back, having one more child, but you know, I love my sons and they're perfect.
Wonderful. Well, this has been fabulous, Sonali. Thank you for firstly opening yourself up and giving us a window to some amazing people, your ba, your grandparents, your dad, your mom. I almost feel like I know them all. So thank you. And what a great career journey. And I have a feeling this is just the first chapter of many chapters to come. And we really hope that we have you back. So thanks again for inspiring, for being who you are.
Thank you so much, Sanjay, for letting me tell my story.
It's been awesome and it'll inspire a lot of people. So thank you.